Welcome to Babycastles Game of the Month Club. We've been doing this a long time now. It's because this is my second time doing it. I did it last year. I wanted to give a talk on Demon Souls. And this year, I wanted to give another talk. But, you know, in keeping more with the spirit of Babycastles, I want to do a smaller indie game instead of, you know, something put out by Sony. So I decided I would give a talk on the game The Flame and the Flood, which hopefully some of you got a chance to play. Just to be PowerPoint-ish and, you know, for administrative stuff, I'm going to hit on a couple topics while talking about this game. Before we actually get to the game itself, I want to talk about kind of the history of the games that lead into The Flame and the Flood. It's really a merging of two genres, the survival game and the roguelike. Then we'll talk a little bit about the history of the studio who made it, the Molasses Flood, how they got this funded. This is a game that was funded by Kickstarter. Then we'll get into the meat of it. We'll talk about, you know, what this game is like, how this game is played, how it's kind of this focus on exploring, crafting, and surviving. And then finally, we'll do the kind of English teacher stuff and get into the sort of the themes of the game, you know, which, being alliterative, are kind of America, apocalypse, and the afterlife. And then I'll have a short section on concluding everything. So, the history of survival games. I'll try to be brief about this. Because it's a big genre. And, you know, I hesitate to say anything as the first. You never want to say anything as the first example of a game, because there's always something you find out that came out earlier that two people played. But kind of the starting point for this genre is Tale of the Sun by Art Dink, who's a very interesting developer and done a lot of really weird stuff, especially on the PlayStation. So this came out in 1997, and you can see very rudimentary, very simple graphics. And kind of what this game was about was, you know, it's a 3D role-playing game where you're this cave person and basically can roam around this huge open field, and you can see like what this open field is like right there. And you kind of just pick up generic assets, all these different assets, to try and survive. If you played Flame and the Flood, you're like, yeah, some of these elements are already familiar. And kind of the point of the game is you're trying to build this tower to reach the sun made out of mammoth tusks. And it's very weird, but like already you can start to see some of the fundamental elements of what this genre is and stuff that you totally experienced in Flame and the Flood when, there it is, you've got to hunt. And this is kind of a departure for games at the time. You know, you'd have games where you'd have power-ups, you'd have games where you had items lying around. But this is the first one to really incorporate hunting into it. I guess the other example, you know, and it's kind of weird that it doesn't get lumped in here, I guess because it's more educational than survival. You all know what I'm thinking. It's Oregon Trail. Yeah, and that'll come up again later in this presentation. But it's weird that there's kind of nothing in between there. There's that game, and then years later, we start to get to stuff like Tale of the Sun. So you can see this is stuff you do in Flame and the Flood, and you collect meat. It's like exact same stuff. One of what I thought was the most interesting sort of innovations of the game is if you stay out too late, you fall asleep. Your character will just kind of like pass out in the middle of the field. And, you know, again, like having to manage hunger, having to manage exhaustion. These are kind of the things that start to set what this genre is. What's also a funny note is that that feature is still in the American version of the game, but I guess they decided that like American players would get very mad if your character just fell asleep randomly, and so you can still wake them up. But in the Japanese version, they just fall asleep and you have to deal with it. Okay. What I would say is kind of the bigger, probably more popular example, and the example that probably creates more of this genre, is Survival Kids for the Game Boy Color by Konami in '99. So you can see it's a very cute little overhead typey game that you would play on Game Boy Color. But again, it's starting to incorporate these real world elements. Yeah, it's a game that looks like Zelda, but you have stuff like, oh, I have to do more inventory management. I just can't carry unlimited items. So you see the kid has to pick up a knapsack there, right? You have to do more stuff like sleeping, finding a place to rest, gathering food. There it is, picking up an apple. Instead of this being a power-up, this is now necessary, right? Instead of this like being like, oh, okay, my health is down, I eat an apple or like a piece of meat out of a wall or a garbage can to power up. The gameplay revolves around picking up this equipment, picking up this stuff. The other thing that really starts to become this genre, and it's something that is basically almost in every game now, is crafting. Right? I don't know that this is the first game with crafting, but this is a major game with crafting. You can combine a vine with a piece of tree to form a bow, and then you need a feather and a rock to make an arrow. Literally, again, this is the crafting system in Flame in the Flood. You have to find stuff that's lying around to create survival tools. And kind of starting into the roguelike elements, the randomness elements that we'll talk about in a little bit, you get meat, you get food, and there's like flowers, flora, and fauna in the game. But what I thought was interesting is they change every time you restart the game. So like some items will always do the same thing, but certain flowers that you pick up, their effects on you change. So the only way to know what they do is to use them, and they could be bad for you. You can't count on anything being the same.
Roguelike.
Yes. Yeah. A little bit of that. So the next big one is Disaster Report by Irem in 2003. This is kind of a high extension of survival because this is survival in a disaster. Here in Disaster Report, it is you trying to survive after an earthquake. You can kind of see, the devastation there. And even if you'll look, this is Flame in the Flood. Again, this is you going down a giant river, ruined buildings and ruined street signs above you. All these things start to lead into it. And one of the big things that you start to see now creep into survival games, because it's on a more powerful system, you have weather. And you have to deal with it. So you can see our protagonist in his little umbrella there and his little rainproof outfit. But it's like, again, it's this changing of the standard adversarial relationship of games. There aren't any enemies. Your enemies are temperature, hunger, the environment. Another thing, again, getting into specificity of this, there's plenty of water all around, but part of the game revolves around getting clean water. And again, as you see in Flame in the Flood, there's no shortage of water, but most of it is dirty. Most of it is polluted. So even just getting clean water is a big deal. Our next big piece would be this guy. Old Snake here, which is to show that like the elements of this type of gameplay are creeping into multi-million-dollar AAA development. Metal Gear had always been this sort of spy action-adventure game, and suddenly for the third one, they're putting him in the jungle and making the environment part of the danger, and making him have to get through a hostile environment not only for the enemies, but because what's in the environment. Now, it helps in this game in that like you can use the jungle to camouflage yourself and sneak around, which is a big part of Metal Gear. But in sort of stuff that you also starts to become what we see in modern survival games, there's this big emphasis on like the minutia of keeping yourself alive. It was kind of simplified and straightforward in Survival Kids and Disaster Report. Here you have, I have camouflage, I have what's in my backpack, I have food, I have to keep my health up if I get injured. So, per the title of the game, you're a snake eater, right? You're in the jungle. This is stuff you can eat. And it's a nice balance because, yeah, a snake can kill you, but if you capture it, you can eat it and gain sustenance from it. Or, and this is the thing that definitely you experienced in playing Flame in the Flood, you don't just get hurt, you have specificity of injury. It's not just, I lost 10 health points. Snake might get burned. He might get a broken limb. He might get gunshot. And these are different types of injuries which require different types of cures and different types of inventory to cure those injuries. So you see that in Flame in the Flood. Like, getting a bee sting requires aloe. Getting bit by a wolf requires a bandage. So you're seeing all these elements, but different games put the focus somewhere else. Some games, it's very much about survival. Here, the emphasis, literally is in the title, it's crafting. This is a game all about being in a giant open environment, being in a kind of randomly generated environment, gathering resources and trying to build things from them and trying to survive in this world. But that still, it incorporates some of our elements because you have a hunger meter. And if it gets depleted, you start to lose health. A fishing rod. All this stuff is coming back. Kind of later examples, when you get to Don't Starve in 2013, whereas like most of the previous games, you're mostly dealing with the environment. When you get to Don't Starve, you really start to have these kind of enemies come in, these spider monsters, which we see kind of mirrored in Flame in the Flood when you deal with the boars, with the wolves, with the bears. Even more so on the adversarial sense, you literally have an enemy. When it goes dark, a monster called Charlie tries to kill you, which is like, okay, cool. So it's weird that this thing that initially starts out as like, we're going to get so far away from the tropes of video games, like no enemies, just the environment, slowly starts to weave back in very video gamey elements. But the more it does that, the more popular the genre has gotten, right? It really exists kind of in its most popular form is hybridization, right? Taking some of these ideas and putting other stuff into them or putting them onto other genres. And actually, this was the game I was actually going to talk about. So this is Metal Gear Survive. A lot of Konami on this list. I kind of played this back-to-back with Flame in the Flood. And I know this is not a very popular game. It was my game of the year last year. But this is a big budget, military shooter where all the stuff that was in Snake Eater that was kind of this addition to Snake's Adventure becomes the focus of the game. It is surviving in a hostile environment. There's only like one or two enemy types in the whole game. It is mostly about, do you have enough food? Do you have enough water? Running around and trying to secure that stuff in a dangerous environment with zombies. And, that these things coexist, that this has become like a regular part of gameplay. Or like a thing that is just in normal games now. The way like RPG stuff has entered into games. The way leveling up has entered into most modern games. The way crafting has entered into most modern games. Right. These are elements that everybody is kind of familiar with. But it did start out in this very weird, isolated corner. Well, the other thing that the Flame in the Flood draws from is another kind of weird evolutionary branch that's kind of slowly worked its way into most modern games, and that's the roguelike. So, this is Rogue. This is a game. This is 1980s Rogue, which is a very, very old-fashioned type of game. But what made it attractive to players at the time was certain elements of it. Well, here they are. One, it's about exploring and discovery. But lots of games in the 80s are about exploring and discovery, right? Legend of Zelda is about exploring and discovery. But in comparison to that game, and what drew people to Rogue, especially on PCs, is it is a randomly generated environment. Every time you start the game over again, the dungeon is completely randomly generated. That's part of why it's so simplistic looking. You basically have Lego blocks building it, but they can be rebuilt in any shape and form. It also has resource management, which is kind of where it directly crosses over with the survival game. This is coming out of like Dungeons and Dragons stuff. You have a weight limit. You can only carry so much stuff. Other qualities are there's several solutions to problems. So if you encounter a monster, there are multiple ways to deal with it. A door can be kicked down, or it can be broken down, or burned, or it can be unlocked. It gives you a lot of player freedom. What these are trying to mimic is the experience of tabletop roleplay. They're trying to mimic how free you can be to improvise in those games, but in a computer format. And kind of the big thing that defines Rogue is permadeath, which is, again, we talk about these deviations from standard gameplay. If you die in this game, you can't continue. That's it. Just as you only see the dungeon you're in once, your character lives only once. Like the tabletop roleplay, every experience is different. It is not a repeatable experience. And how do I know these are all the parts of Rogue? Literally, these were what they were decided at the International Rogue Development Conference in 2008 in Berlin. Well, no, because this is kind of a very influential game, and people still play this. Rudimentary as this is, people still play this, and there kind of had to be a discussion of, well, what is a Rogue game? What spins out of this? So you most likely have played some of the successors. The Mystery Dungeon series by Chunsoft in 1993. You might have played the Dragon Quest or the Pokemon variant of it. This is Shiren the Wanderer. If you've played Diablo, Diablo incorporates a lot of these ideas, but it actually looks nice. If you played Splunky by Derek Yu, that has a lot of these elements. If you played Edmund Macmillan's The Binding of Isaac, that has a lot of these elements. And if you played Motion Twin's Dead Cells, that has a lot of these elements. What you start to notice, though, is a lot of this is appearing recently in the indie sphere. Right? Because once developers figured out how to do this, this became a very powerful way to generate a lot of content for users. Right? A finely crafted experience is very difficult to make and can take a long time and a lot of energy to make. A randomly generated or procedurally generated environment puts a lot less of burden on the developer. They can set up the engine to develop things, but they don't have to handcraft everything you ever see. The engine can. So, that gets us to the making of The Flame and the Flood. Who made this game? These people. This is the Molasses Flood. Yeah, 6 people made this game, which is phenomenal. Right? Who are they? Forrest Dowling, the CEO, who also worked on BioShock and Homefront. Scott Sinclair, who's the art director, who worked on BioShock and Guitar Hero. Bryn Brennett, who did a lot of the tech, who worked on Freedom Force 2, Titan Quest, and Rock Band. Chad Leclerc, who did some of the art, who worked on BioShock Infinite. Damien Isla, who did tech, who worked on Halo 2 and 3, and again, BioShock Infinite. And Gwen Frey, who worked on, again, you're seeing it, BioShock Infinite, and Marvel Heroes. And if you were listening to music before, and also because he's kind of the hidden member of this, Chuck Reagan of Hot Water Music did the soundtrack for Flame and the Flood. Okay, so the Molasses Flood. How did you get this name? Well, if you love disasters, you know about the Molasses Flood in Boston, where a giant molasses tanker exploded and became like a slow-moving wave down the streets of Boston, killing and crushing everything in its path. That'll give you a sense of the scope of the devastation. Yeah. So, speaking of the incident, Scott Sinclair, he says, we're looking for something local. We wanted a name that was memorable and wasn't a tech company name. We wanted something that spoke to where we're located in Boston. And Forrest Dowling said, we wanted something that's fun and light, but also dark. It's weird that this molasses covered the north side. It's weird and funny, but people died, and it actually led to a lot of new regulations for the industry. That's the dark side. That speaks to the creative decisions I want to make, that contrast. So this game kind of came from another disaster. This one. BioShock Infinite, which is why I made sure to note that they all kind of worked on this game. Right, BioShock Infinite ships in March 2013. It's the highest rated video game of 2013. Within 2 months of release, it sold over 37 million retail copies, and it's since sold more than 11 million copies overall. So, in theory, this is a big success, right? And it wins Game of the Year from 42 publications. The company who made it closes a year after it comes out. So basically, what happens is all these people worked on this humongously successful game. And within a year of that game coming out, they're all out of jobs. And these are people talking about what happened at Irrational. There was a willful disbelief. Some submitted to the idea that the company would live forever because they had shipped BioShock. And another anonymous source, Levine, this is Ken Levine, the head of Irrational, Levine definitely wanted to work in a smaller studio. It wasn't clear until a few days ago how much smaller. Yeah, so basically, like a 100-person company lays off 90% of its staff. And, some of those members are the people who form the Molasses Flood. This is Forrest Dowling again. I knew there had been questions about the viability of the types of projects that Irrational had done up to that point. Games are a super tough market, and making a big, expensive single-player narrative game is a difficult and risky proposition. There's a sense that Irrational was going to want to try something different. It ended up taking the form of something very small that didn't need that team size. So, yeah, Irrational shrunk, and to this day, they haven't put anything else out. So, Scott Sinclair. I wanted to get back to a place where it's a small team and I actually have to make the art, not just manage the art team. At the time it happened, it wasn't just Irrational, it was Turbine and Harmonix who did Rock Band, right, which other members of this team worked on. I went to a game industry drink night, a layoff drink night, and it was a sea of programmers, artists, and designers all laid off, all around the same time. You can see, even that night, groups of people splitting off and saying, what if we did something? And I kind of love that moment, that basically, like, all these people who had been gainfully employed at big developers in Boston were like, well, what now? And in a great moment that's perfect for the time that it happened in 2014, they're like, oh, we'll just start our own studio. We can do that. Here they are. You'll see a lot of this comes from the Game Informer article on them. It's just kind of like an incredible article for such a small... Like, the article was written before the game even came out. So, great journalism on Game Informer's part. But this is from Bryn Bennett. It's not many times we get to jump to a company with all really good people. It seemed like an opportunity that I didn't want to let pass by. There's a lot of good energy here in the making of this game. Forrest Allen. I've been doing big first-person shooters for nearly a decade. He's talking about Bioshock. I knew that what I did was about as critically acclaimed as it can be. I'm not sure I'll ever be able to do something that's substantially better. So I wanted to do something substantially different. Right? He's like, I made the best-selling game, the biggest game of 2013. What's left for me to do now? So after Irrational closed, we had savings, but we knew that wasn't going to go far enough to make the full game. So in kind of another piece of the story that is very much of the time it was made, they funded on Kickstarter. Kickstarter launched on October 7th, 2014. So really in the center of big Kickstarter hype, this is Mighty Number 9 time. But this is when this is in full bloom. I mean, former Game of the Month, Hyper Light Drifter, was Kickstarted, right?
Yeah. Or Cuphead.
Cuphead too, yeah. So some duds came out of it, but a lot of really important indie games came out of Kickstarter. And you look, their goal is very modest. $150,000 for game development is nothing. Absolutely nothing. And their stretch goal is less than $500,000. Imagine going from being at Irrational making Bioshock Infinite, which took about 7 years and was like hundreds of millions of dollars. And now you're down to this. Dowling again. It seemed approachable now in a way it didn't a few years ago. And yeah, in 2014, it really was a viable method. I feel like I can take a shot now. 4 years ago, it would have seemed like a much crazier risk. I have a huge respect for the indies that forged this path. The first people who were getting stuff out on Xbox Live. Jonathan Blow with Braid. Or Supergiant. They've done a great service for people like myself. I can see a way to form my own company and make my own games. That's a path to customers without the backing of a major publisher. So let's take a look at the Kickstarter video.
In the backwaters beyond fables and years, moving on, there's a silence that may be heard loud and clear. Simple, wild and natural cadence. Keep my eyes open, keep my ears sharpened. There's nothing to fear but fear itself. Oh, desperation, chasing horizon in the flame and the flood. Through the briars and the brambles of my tears, there's no failure in true survival. All the trials and tales of old that come me near help keep my head above the water. Keep my eyes open, keep my ears sharpened. There's nothing to fear but fear itself. Oh, desperation, chasing horizon in the flame and the flood.
So you can see, even at this stage, the vision for the game is pretty much there. There's no actual gameplay, those are all renders, but if you've played the game, you've played a lot of those scenes. I also think it's cool because there are scenes in there that are nowhere in game. So, they had 7,420 backers who pledged about $250,000 to help bring the project to life. So they made their goal. They didn't meet their stretch goals, but they definitely made their goals to get the game done. It was released about 2 years later for Windows, Mac OS, and Xbox One. Actually, I feel like for a little bit of time it was an Xbox One exclusive when they were kind of into that. It was later released about a year later in January 2017 for the PlayStation 4, and the way I played it physically in September 2017 by Limited Run Games. It was then in October 2017 for the Switch, and there was even a physical version of that released last year from Super Rare Games. I have both. And because I now love this game so much, like it's very special to me that I can look at a copy I own of this game. You know what I mean? I can take it down from the shelf. So now we can actually start talking about the game. I know it's taken a while, but hopefully you've all at least played it a little bit, so you know what it is. But let's talk about it kind of in the context of some of the other things we've talked about. Dowling says, the jokey description of the game is it's like Tubin meets, which is a game where you go down the river on an inner tube, meets the Oregon Trail. Yeah, and the Oregon Trail influence is strong. So this is a game about, and going back to our terms of roguelikes, this is a game about exploration and discovery. You are going down the river and seeing what you find as you head down the river. Speaking for myself, I've always had a hard time staying engaged with a game that doesn't have a longer form purpose or a goal. That could be maxing out a character in a multiplayer shooter or completing a campaign. We felt that a clear objective or end goal was something that was missing from the permadeath survival game genre, and felt like we could do something a bit different there. So yeah, even just giving you a goal, which is get to the end of the river, go down the river, instead of just survive, kind of changes the nature of the game. You're always moving forward. You're always pushing towards something. We'll watch the opening cinematic here. You know, this is like a classic setup of a lot of stories, right? Or the end point of a lot of stories. If you've read Stephen King's The Mist, it ends with them hearing a garbled radio signal and going, well, we got to go there. So you sail down the procedurally generated river. You know, it's not randomly generated the way Rogue is. There are some kind of rule sets to it. And this is, you know, where you spend a good portion of the game. Dowling says it's procedural, but it's not random. There's always going to be an arc of experience that we're building into it. So, right, there's a very much a sense of like, if you encounter certain things, if you go to the church or you go to the drugstore, then farther down the river, different things will appear depending on what your inventory is, what your stats are, what you visited. We can watch a little of them building it. So this is kind of how the game is building the river while you're playing. And there you are. You're on the river. You've encountered this screen where you can see there's all these different choices you can go to, right? But as you know, you can't go to all of them. So Dowling says, the setting was largely a result of a variety of mechanical needs. I was looking for a mechanic, something like the Rebel fleet from FTL, Faster Than Light, was always pushing forward and forcing player decisions, preventing them from hitting every possible stop. You can't just gather up every resource. You can't hit every spot on the river and grab everything, because the river pushes you downstream. So if you say, go to the bait shop, you might not be able to go to the camping ground. If you go to the church, you probably can't go to the hospital. And so you kind of got to make that decision on the fly. Well, I know what these different places might have item-wise. Which one am I going to go to? It reminds me of this, which is, another big game at the time, right? You're having to make tough decisions quickly. So you land on a different dock at a different location. And, these two are procedurally generated. They're kind of a few different archetypes, but they'll still have different little details. So there is the bait shack, there is the drugstore, the liquor store, the hardware store. But there's also a couple unique environments, and this is actually why I'm really glad I replayed the game. There are occasionally environments that aren't like anything else, and there are occasionally objects that you won't see in any other environment. I only saw this tire swing once, right? And it was interesting because when I watched the Kickstarter, the tire swing is there, these windmills. Yeah, I only saw them once. I've kind of beat this game a couple times now. And I was like, oh, I'm really glad I snapped a picture of this because this is a distinct place. And I really like this touch about this game because, most places kind of look the same. But occasionally something will be specific. And that makes it feel all the more real. I also saw this, this stone arch. Yeah, when you get to the desert kind of area of the game. I'm sure there are more, but you'd have to play it multiple times to see it. Or, kind of the nice part is if you played with a friend, you'd be like, oh, did you see the windmills? You're like, no, I never saw the windmill farm. And they'd be like, but it's there. Maybe. So, in these areas, you're going to be doing this. Yeah, you're gathering resources. You're grabbing up items. Because that leads into another of our roguelike elements, resource management, crafting. If you played this game, you have looked at this menu a lot. And you've done a lot of this. Alright, I'm going to take this tinder. Alright, and I'm going to make a campfire. I love that little tone that it makes when you build stuff. And I'm going to build a fire. Right, and you sit at it and get warm. And it's not only crafting stuff to, keep you alive, you're crafting stuff to keep your raft going down the river and repairing it and doing upgrades on it. If you get far enough in the game, look, I got a little stove, I got a little tent, there's a water purifier. Kind of one of the weird arcs of this game is, it gets easier the longer you play. When you start out, it is so desperate and so hard. But as you get about 3/4 down the river, you kind of have everything you need.
So it's harder in the beginning.
Oh, it's way harder, because you don't have anything. You don't have the recipes for crafting stuff until you pick up all the ingredients. So you don't know what you can make yet. But by the time you're pretty far down the river, you have all this stuff, and you don't need to get fresh water because you can purify it, right? You don't need to build a fire because you have a stove. And Dowling says, my hope is that people experience a sense of mastery over the game as they play. After learning and overcoming the ins and outs of survival, I wanted to capture the sort of moment-to-moment reflex joy of dealing with the immediate threat of rapids, coupled with the longer-term joy of being rewarded for careful planning and decision-making. As you learn to survive in this environment, it becomes less desperate. It is not a desperate struggle once you know what to do. You know what items to keep, what items to leave. You know how much you're going to need to get farther down the river. But when you start the game, you don't. And part of the arc of the game, the empowerment arc of the game, because you never get stronger, your avatar never levels up, but you level up in knowledge of what to do. And that gets to another of our roguelike ideas. There are several solutions to problems in terms of survival. Dowling says, I think the main difference between The Flame and the Flood and other survival games is that we're very focused on the journey. A lot of survival games are really focused on building a base or homestead of some sort, planting crops, making a home. Because we focused on real-world survival, we focused more on always moving forward, trying to get somewhere. I think that's the biggest difference. You are never kind of just building up and amassing power. You are always trying to deal with new situations because you are always in a new environment. You are always in a new situation. You don't have a sort of safe place other than the dock. When you're on the river, there's stuff you can run into. When you're in the wilderness, there's all kinds of things that can hurt you, so you have to deal with them. All the objects the player faces are based on real-world threats that somehow they may encounter in the wilderness. Wolves, snakes, wild boars, that sort of thing. Additionally, the environment provides a constant challenge. Cold nights, rain, and rapids. I suppose the biggest adversary throughout the game is yourself. You need to stay fed, hydrated, rested, and warm. Again, so these are our survival elements, survival game elements. But you can warm yourself by a fire. Or, if there's no fire, you can sleep in a church or in the back of a school bus, which will also heal your fatigue meter. And then you gotta feed yourself. Well, you can hunt and kill animals, right? You can trap rabbits. I think there's like an achievement if you make it through the game not killing any animals, but it is really, really hard to survive not eating animals. And wildlife is where a lot of this having to have multiple solutions occurs. There are the crows, which actually, if you didn't realize, signal wolves towards you. So you want to chase them off. Well, let's learn a bit more. It's interesting because, like, the one about snakes being attracted to fire, I never figured that out. I had to watch this video they made to figure that out. But having played it a couple times, I learned more things. I used to only kill the wolves with the spike trap. You know, I was like, oh, I caught a lot of rabbits. What do I do with this? I have more meat than I can use. You poison the meat and throw it at the wolves, and I got an achievement for killing a lot of wolves that way. But my whole first playthrough, when I made it all the way down the river, I had no idea you could do that. Yeah, and fighting back against the wildlife becomes a major part of the problem solving. So, let's look at a little how you do that. It's a pretty intense game. Yeah. I also figured this out. You can get the other animals to attack each other. You can get the wolves to attack the bears. You can get the snakes to attack other creatures. You know, you can get all kinds of like different combinations of this depending on what's going on. But just if you've played the game, you realize it doesn't tell you any of this stuff. You got to figure it out on your own. But then when you figure it out, you're like, oh wow, I've discovered this huge survival tactic I had no idea I could use. Of course, if this all fails, you're dead. And just like all roguelikes, this game has permadeath. It can be a little more lenient. I think like the easy mode gives you a couple checkpoints down the river, and sometimes you can reload your last save. One of the other tips, and again, you might not know it, and only if you encounter Cocteau do you figure this out. Whatever you put on your dog, Aesop or Daisy, when you start a new game, they'll have those items. So you kind of can continue on a little bit of your progress from the last time you played. Or if you have a couple really good items, they'll be waiting for you. And you even look at the beginning of the game, that's you. There's this weird like cycle of, you know, when you die in the game, Aesop will always drag the bag to the next you. So I would say this is one of the most American games I've ever played, in a lot of different ways. Clearly, there's no doubt that that's where it's set. This is the American flag. But there's a lot of very American stuff to this game. Dowling again. Scout is a young and a coming-of-age point in her life. She's a survivor in this world, knows how to live, but young enough that there's wonderment left. She's competent, but she's just coming to the stage of adulthood. There's a dog who's a faithful companion, but maybe not the fierce hunter he once was. The world itself is based on the idea of the American backwater, particularly the rural South, although we don't want to put a specific time or place. And I really like that, because, like, there's this way in which it feels like it's an environment that hasn't been explored much. If it is, it's usually in, like, a swampy, scary version of it. So there it is. You're heading down the river. And who does that remind you of in American kind of folklore? These two. Tom, Huck, some other guy, right? But going down the river on a raft is like such an American kind of set of imagery. And yeah, and really these characters. Well, there's also some other very Americana characters that you'll encounter all along the way. There's Flim Flam, which is, selling you his potions, which is basically this guy. The Flim Flam man. He's a snake oil salesman. This is a very, Wild Westy Americana character. Meet Quincy here, who's kind of our rugged mountain man, like this guy. Although, I'm sure having played this game, you know that anybody who's out in the wilderness here is a little more this guy. and Timothy Treadwell, again, an American who went out into the wilderness. I don't know if this stuff is intentional, but I kind of feel like that this story is part of what creates the thematics of this game, of what does it mean to be an American who goes out into the wilderness. And we know for Treadwell, it did not end in a good way. Well, there was another guy I started thinking about. Do you ever notice how many school buses are in this game? Well, it made me think about this. So after graduating school, Christopher Johnson, McCandless, ceased communicating with his family, gave away all his stuff, started walking the Stampede Trail from Alaska, kind of goes out into the wilderness and perishes, and his body is found later in a school bus. And I was like, okay, the yellow school bus is a very Americana image, but man, it's in the game a lot. I don't know exactly what it symbolizes, but thinking about McCandles, it's like, maybe that there's something going on here. You look at the world design, this ruined America. Well, where does this come from? I actually know a little bit about this. Dowling again. One of the cornerstones of our creative reference library is Beast of the Southern Wild, right, which would have come out kind of around this time the game is developing. Kind of this ruined, semi-rural world.
It's a movie?
Yeah. It's kind of like a magical realist sort of post-Katrina Louisiana story about the young girl picture there. But that's like the raft they go sailing around on. And I was like, oh yeah, this is where they're pulling from. And that movie is kind of one of the movies people point to when they start talking about climate change disaster movies. And this game is about an apocalypse, right? Look at this. This is the end of the world. Again, the school bus. But everything is destroyed here. Everything is flooded. This is a climate change game. It doesn't ever really tell us that, but I think this is where this is coming from. Dowling says, we prefer post-societal. Apocalyptic implies some kind of mass extinction event, and that wasn't something we wanted to go straight into saying. We didn't want to go, oh yeah, this happened, horrible thing happened, and everybody died. It's more of, well, it's a mystery. Right. Why is this car here? Who are these people? What happened? We never find out. What happened to these houses? What happened at this evacuation site? Why are these satellite dishes all rusted? We get a little bit of it, and again, you might find these. Now, I caught these over multiple playthroughs, these quilts, talking about good Phil Droog, who talked about how the apocalypse wasn't really happening, reading a book that says, see, there's no disaster. Again, this is a climate change game. Even when the disaster is at his door, he won't recognize it. Another guy hunkering down in his bunker, even though the government is ordering an evacuation. Or an industrialist who decides not to leave on the evacuation because he's like, we polluted the earth. We deserve to stay here. But again, it never tells us why or what. We know something happened. We know there was an evacuation, but we don't know what happened beyond that. And then you get images like this. This is a unique NPC in a unique environment. There's this car with the skulls coming out of it. Dowling says, I think Cormac McCarthy's The Road is an interesting example. And that it's fairly clear there was some sort of nuclear event, but that's never what the story is. That's not what it's about. It's more about the people trying to survive in this world. And again, this is a big influence on the design in this game. There's a shot from the film version of the road. All these bent telephone poles. Bent telephone poles.
The Last of Us was really influenced by that one too.
Yeah.
That was a pretty big one.
These broken highways. Broken highways. This is drawing from stuff, but it is making it its own. And it's not just the end of the world. Again, you might not run into Cocteau, but he says this. Welcome to the afterworld, traveler. This is the end of the world. This is also the afterworld. That's what it is, I reckon, the world after. After a disaster. But when he says that, do you notice something here? Because it took me a long time to see it. Whose grave is he digging? Yours. This is the afterlife. Or, moreover, I said this is the most American game I've ever played. This is the most Christian game I've ever played. I've never played a game where I so distinctly felt this was made by not only people in America, but people of a Christian background. You know this because there are so many churches in this game. Castlevania doesn't have as many churches as this game. It's interesting. These are people who kind of have a different background than game developers have had in the past. Or like, maybe people have had it in the past, but now they're getting to make a personal project. And their personal lives are starting to influence what the game is about. Going back to the Kickstarter again, look at this. There's a church with a shining light coming out of it. This great light behind a church. Right? This is baked into the very formation of this game and baked into the ideas of this game. So, this is a game about a flood. So, as much as we're thinking about climate change, we can also think about this guy. Yeah, this is biblical flood, right? This is a flood of biblical proportions. But I also thought about something else. Because of the nature of this, and you're right, it is very southern, it is very rural. There are a lot of churches in the wilderness, and it feels like a potent idea. I found this line in Acts 7:38. This is he, and they're referring to Moses, that was in the church in the wilderness with the angel which spake to him in the Mount Sinai, and with our fathers who received the lively oracles given unto us. So we're talking about when Moses climbs the mountain and communes with God, and that's how we get the Ten Commandments, right? That's when Moses is in the desert, and he's on his pilgrimage to find the Holy Land. This is Exodus. That's what this game is about. That's the journey you take on this game.
Getting out of the desert?
Yeah. You get your instructions, right? You head down the river and pass by even more churches. And if you got about halfway through, you got to this gate, right? And you climb to the top, and there's this radio tower. And you get the signal, please proceed to Angel Yards for evacuation. It's not subtle. Angel Yards. Keep going, past more churches. If you get about this far to Angel Yards, your raft crashes. And you explore. And this is the evacuation site. But what's going on? There's nobody here. Everybody's gone. And the rocket's still here. They never made it to heaven. And on the rocket, once you kind of chase the bear away, I bear unfortunate tidings, friends. Rockets are dead. Ain't no way off this world. Not no more. No use crying about it neither. There's a place for you. The kingdom offers salvation for all left behind. Head south to the sea. That's what you'll find. So, again, very heavy-handed. The kingdom. You'll sail past the industrial wastes, keep going down the river, and here you are. These are our conclusions. Sorry, I'm going to spoil it for you. So just to reflect on that, I mean, there it is. This is the kingdom of heaven. I like that it's represented as like kind of a chintzy, retro-futuristic amusement park.
Like, just like Epcot Center.
Yeah,
Like
it's
Disney.
it's a World of Tomorrow
Magic
Epcot
Kingdom.
Center. Yeah. But think about what's also there. You spent the whole game starving, and suddenly there's food. Right? They're growing food instead of scavenging it. Fields of tomatoes and corn. There's a place for you here. There's a spot waiting for you to hang up your backpack at your home, as opposed to just kind of wandering and searching. Instead of just one dog, there are tons of dogs. Aesop goes home, or Daisy, whichever dog you pick, comes home. There's peace here. You know, the rabbits, you're not chasing them, they're docile. The boars aren't attacking you, right? They're docile. And then finally, the gates open and the light comes through. It's a weird ending question, but I like it. It's like, what's out there? You know, it's like, you went through all this trouble and difficulty and struggle to finally come home to rest. I think the implication is this is a journey through a limbo, through a purgatory to heaven. But like all great art, it's very open for interpretation, and it leaves a lot of questions open, and I really appreciate that. And that's The Flame in the Flood. Thank you for listening.
Wow.